Hello there and welcome to part 2 of a CPT series in which we take fictional characters and assign them personality types based upon their underlying cognitive functions. As you all know, I find it really useful to have a real life, or at least something approximating real life example of how cognitive functions actually manifest within people, or hobbits and elves and dwarves and humans in this case. So in this episode we're going to be looking once again at the Lord of the Rings and taking this time the Fellowship of the Ring, or that is the Fellowship of the Ring that aren't hobbits, because we've already done the hobbits in a previous video. If you haven't already seen that, I've linked it down below in the description, definitely check it out. But before we dive right into the depths of Middle-earth, I do want to say to anyone who is at any point struggling with the terminology and theory used within the video to check out my CPT Principles playlist. You'll find that's been constantly updated with new theoretical information. And I also have an entire ebook dedicated to the subject as well, which you can find a link to in the description and on the channel page. Furthermore, if there are any other fictional characters you'd like to see tapped within this series, definitely let me know down below in the comments. And without further ado, let's dive right into it. So first up, let's take Gandalf the Grey. So when we first meet Gandalf, we're introduced to someone who's been travelling alone for some time. But we also get the impression he's quite comfortable in his own company. Hence why he's singing along the road, hence why he just seems to have that kind of relaxed atmosphere. And throughout the course of the entire first film, he's very comfortable sitting away from people. He's very comfortable in his own space, inhabiting his own internal landscape. But having done that quick fast forward, let's rewind all the way back to the Shire. So his manner of socialising in this time of presumed peace that we're inhabiting in the start of the film, he has very intense one-on-one interactions. He obviously favours one-on-one conversation. When there's a group situation, he suddenly starts performing a more divergent observational role, as will be seen when, for example, he's observing people at Bilbo's party, and when he's just watching out for people such as Merry and Pippin getting up to no good. So it's only really in one-on-one conversations that he seems to come alive socially. When you compare him to Bilbo, who quite happily gets up on stage, talks to a host of people, or quite happily entertains a group of children with stories of trolls, himself being an ENTP, we notice a dramatic contrast between the use of extrovert feeling between Bilbo and Gandalf. Bilbo uses extrovert feeling in a very plethoric manner, whereas Gandalf tends to be more direct and specific with his application and tends to abstain from employing extrovert feeling when talking to a group. When it's a group, it becomes much more direct and authoritative. It's very common for a more assertive INFJ when in a group situation to, rather than just abstain from interacting with it entirely like many INFJs would, to instead use their extrovert thinking alongside extrovert intuition, or perhaps even extrovert sensing like an ENTJ, to just take charge of the situation, to just issue a command, to forego any kind of extrovert feeling nuance, and just issue instructions and expect them to be obeyed, or demonstrate facts and expect people to heed the wisdom in this knowledge. Furthermore, even outside of the films, we know that Gandalf has a reputation amongst kingdoms for being someone who gives counsel, someone who counsels kings on the appropriate course of decision making. So obviously Gandalf is used to playing an advisory role. Gandalf is used to performing the role of a sage, or even as an oracle within Middle-earth. And thus so far, despite his rather intense and oftentimes bipolar extroverted side, which I myself can relate to, he does seem to be inhabiting a primarily introverted space of reflection and contemplation, and as soon as the One Ring enters the play, this becomes multiplied. He suddenly starts spending a lot more time alone. He suddenly starts staring into the fire, mumbling to himself. He suddenly starts travelling alone more. And even when they're in a fellowship, even though he's supposed to be the leader, he spends most of the time away from the group, contemplating. It's others such as Gimli who must come up to him for his counsel, or come up to him in order to have a conversation with him. And throughout the entire course of the Fellowship of the Ring, he favours one-on-one interaction. As soon as One Ring entered the play, Gandalf suddenly stepped into his role as the oracle of the films. He started planning contingencies in his brain. He started reflecting upon all of these social implications and ruminating upon his generations of wisdom acquired within his mind in order to predict the most likely outcome, in order to account for all the possibilities, in order to essentially plan a chain of causality within his brain. And since so little information was available to him at this point, his plan A was the safe option. Plan A was to assemble a Council of Old, Zaraman, Elrond, Galadriel, and then plan with a group of people in a very extroverted feeling manner the appropriate course of action to take. However, as soon as he realised Zaraman was turned rogue, this path became less likely, and as he probably predicted, Elrond told him the ring cannot stay in Rivendell. But in the Council of Elrond scene, when Frodo gets up and volunteers to take the ring to Mordor, Gandalf's face sinks, but it also displays that this is a possibility, or even a probability that he had accounted for, that this is something he had actually maybe even expected. And when people start flocking to Frodo's side to accompany him, as soon as they were inspired by his bravery and as soon as they realised they didn't want to be outdone by other races, Gandalf winked at Elrond because he knew exactly how it was all going to unfold. This is not limited to this scene. Gandalf is intrinsically connected to the interconnectivity behind everything. He's intrinsically connected to the god, essentially, of Middle-earth, himself being a Maiar. And as such, the concept of destiny is prevalent within Gandalf the Grey. The concept of fate and determinism. These are very much concepts which are intertwined with this primary utility of contemplation and reflection. This is all classic INFJ material so far. And Gandalf's predictions go beyond Frodo taking the ring to Mordor. They also extend to Aragorn, not just Aragorn taking up the mantle of king, not just Aragorn leading the Fellowship in Gandalf's stead, but also Aragorn effectively taking up the mantle of Gandalf the Grey, taking up the mantle of this wise, contemplative, peace-seeking, culturally intelligent INFJ, interconnected to the determinism of the entire world, and optimistic and faithful in his pursuit of justice and harmony. When Gandalf told Aragorn to lead them on, the bridge is near, he wasn't just issuing a basic instruction. He was already aware that it was likely he would fall to the Balrog of Morgoth. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you look at the difference in stature, when you compare the difference in power. And he was already connected to a sense of destiny. And maybe a part of him was connected to his next incarnation as well. And as such, these final words of Gandalf to Aragorn actually echo a lot more significance than what may initially be apparent. Because it is through Aragorn that Gandalf the Grey lives on. It is through Aragorn that Gandalf the Grey's vision and his role of an oracle continues into the future and guides not only the Fellowship, but the races of Middle-earth towards the future envisioned by the spiritual interconnectedness of the entire planet. So is Aragorn then an INFJ too? Well, yes, but not exactly the same as Gandalf. Gandalf is a much more similar INFJ to me. It's a pretty rare manifestation of the type. The introverted intuition and introverted thinking are very high in magnitude, and thus the extrovert sensing and extrovert feeling divergent functions are equally high in magnitude and are thus kind of bipolar in nature. It's a person alternating between this extreme reclusive contemplative nature and this sudden intense, socially lively nature. But Aragorn is a much more typical INFJ. He's much more neutral. He doesn't inhabit this really intense, kaleidoscopic introverted intuition, but nor does he come alive in people's presence in the same way that Gandalf does. And as such, Aragorn doesn't display the stereotypes associated with being an INFJ. He doesn't display this lack of spatial awareness, he doesn't display this kind of hypersensitivity. And nor does he display an aversion to employment of expert thinking. If Gandalf is inhabiting in the region of INFJ, because that's all type is, a dot around here, towards the outer extremity, well, Aragorn will be all the way over here instead. So in this zone here, Aragorn will be inhabiting somewhere about here, which is closer in proximity to ISFJ here and ENFP there. And as such, yes, he's an INFJ, but he's also a very, very different type nonetheless. But despite these initial differences, he also has a lot of similarities with Gandalf the Grey, especially after he takes up his mantle. He spends much time away from the group, in his own space, contemplating, reflecting. He definitely has a lot more introverted feeling, conscious activation than Gandalf, and this is primarily, if not entirely, due to his recent breakup with Arwen. When an INFJ is in a state of loss, they'll be dwelling more on their emotions than their thoughts, even if those emotions aren't necessarily that vivid and conscious. They'll still be drawn more towards the place from which the hurt and the pain is emanating. Furthermore, despite his aversion to destiny, which is primarily to do with an antagonistic relationship with introverted sensing, Aragorn still displays the typical introverted, intuitive, dominant, future tense orientation. He's constantly trying to re-assimilate, much as Gandalf does, all the information in the moment in order to effectively plan and form strategies within his mind. Just like Gandalf, he has a great sense of forward motion, and his mind is always internalizing information in order to form an ideal future within his brain. Just like Gandalf, Aragorn's very uncomfortable exerting extroverted feeling influence over the world when in a group situation, but we do notice when he's focusing on one-on-one interactions, he becomes a lot more soft-spoken, more nuanced in his mannerisms. When he speaks to Frodo in the inn, when he speaks to Frodo again, when Frodo's asking him about the song he's singing on the way to Weathertop, when he speaks to Boromir in Rivendell, and perhaps most noticeably of all, when he's talking to Theoden in Rohan within the Two Towers. He speaks to Theoden with a lot of respect. He calls him his king. He even bows to Theoden, despite Aragorn himself being a king, acting like a king, and knowing, especially by this point in the film, in his heart, that he is a king. The extroverted feeling authority within Aragorn is rampant. While he may very well bark orders to a group, much like an INFJ who is confident will, when it concerns one-on-one interaction, he's very peaceful. He's very norm-abiding. And he tends to prioritize exerting calm upon a social situation. And the information he intakes through his divergent extroverted feeling, extroverted sensing lens culminates in an extremely wise and composed inner world. A world in which he is very secure, and he's very happy to impart words of wisdom, such as when he does so in the Council of Elrond, when he speaks in response to Boromir's charismatic attempt to take the ring for Gondor. He states that you cannot wield it, none of us can. The ring answers to Sauron alone, it has no other master, in an extremely calming and composed manner. But it is through his reconciliation with the somewhat antagonistic character in relation to Aragorn of Boromir that Aragorn finally overcomes his aversion to destiny. He finally overcomes that paradox whereby introverted sensing effectively blocks the employment of introverted intuition at high magnitude, because a reconciliation between two opposing functions is necessary for the full development and employment of either end. And as such, when Boromir, representing as he does an introverted sensing, introverted thinking framework, finally accepts Aragorn as his king, his captain, his brother, Aragorn is so moved as to say and decide in that moment that he does not know what strength is within his blood, but he will not let their city fall. And it is from this point, and it is because of Boromir's sacrifice, that Aragorn finally becomes the INFJ that he was meant to be. This division between these two almost irreconcilable men of the Fellowship is essentially a microcosm for the state of mankind as a whole, a race of men which are weakened by their own inner struggles, by their own confusion, by their own lack of unity, and effectively susceptible to attack from all angles. And now let's look at Boromir in more depth. So when we're introduced to Boromir, we see someone who's really carrying the weight of mankind on his shoulders, very much upholding the traditions and values and expectations of his community. Boromir is very much the embodiment of not only Gondor, but also man as a whole. You can see that he suffers with that. You can see that he's confused because he hasn't fully emotionally reconciled himself and his own internal unconscious identity with the weight that he's carrying. And he hasn't fully reconciled his own introvert thinking frameworks with the person he is deep down. And again, as demonstrated by his speech within the Council of Elrond and his general mannerisms and the words that he says, we can tell immediately that Boromir is very comfortable talking to a group, very comfortable charismatically standing up in a group of people and persuading them of his cause, filling a large atmosphere with emotions while very much staying true to an identity instilled by a community. This is classic ESFJ behaviour, a dominant function of extroverted feeling adjoined to a lens of extroverted intuition, enabling a person to stand up in front of a group of people and charismatically persuade them of the importance of their introverted sensing, introverted thinking values. Boromir feels very strongly, knows very strongly, the importance of his own culture, the role that Gondor is playing. And while very much blind to the introverted intuitive bigger picture, he is highly cemented in the importance of how things have worked up until this point. And when laying upon his deathbed in Amon Hen, Boromir finally reconciles his introverted sensing with his introverted intuition, just as Aragorn does his introverted intuition with his introverted sensing. And it is this beautiful moment whereby two opposing forces actually unite and both individuals transcend their former selves, because two opposing points in a continuum have finally become reconciled. But if this isn't enough evidence, let's look now to the flashback Faramir has of the victory of Osgiliath, when Boromir is standing in front of all of his troops and embodying all of their emotions, embodying their state, embodying their expectations, embodying the sense of victory. And he looks upon all of the people, and rather than speaking to them as a singular unit, he speaks to them all as individuals at the same time, employing extroverted intuition. He speaks to the hearts and minds of them as somewhat on their level, which is another very important part of the ESFJ mentality, getting on another person's level, and becomes what is essentially one of the lads. He talks about beer, he talks about drinking, and generally he just inspires his troops, anyone under his command, in a very authentic and natural manner. And just as the contrast between these two men microcosmically represents the struggles of the race of man, the contrast between Boromir's insecurity as to his own individual identity and Legolas's strong introverted feeling, introverted intuitive core, essentially sets up a contrast between mankind and elvenkind, this weak divided race of mankind who are perpetually struggling with their identity and completely uncertain about what is right, what is wrong, what's the correct way to progress, what authorities do we need, what hierarchies do we need, what's the correct system of government. This contrasts completely with the elvenkind, who are overall united. They do not war amongst themselves, they are of one mind, one accord. And Legolas represents, again as a microcosm, the unity of elvenkind. So the solid conscious identity of Legolas serves very much as a dramatic contrast to highlight the loss of identity of mankind as seen within the ESFJ Boromir. And unlike Boromir, who uses words to effectively affect his world, Legolas is a man of action. Legolas is a man of few words. It is very rare for Legolas to utter any words which do not have a purpose. Ultimately, most of Legolas's communications and social interactions are done so with an intent. Are used to convey information to somebody, are used to persuade someone, are used to warn someone of an incoming attack. Generally, Legolas chooses his words very wisely and with care, and his primary utility is, unlike Boromir, not one of oration. Legolas's primary utility is of relation to the logic of the external world, and through this relation, a prediction of future outcomes. A sense of natural contingency through internalized introverted intuitive machinations. Legolas is a classic INTJ, and yes, this might sound ridiculous when lined up against the typical INTJ stereotypes of this mastermind, of this grumpy recluse, of this analytical scientist sometimes, but the fact is, these are mostly nonsensical. INTJs are at the core deep introverted feelers who have a natural divergent sense of external order. And one of the first interactions Legolas has in the film is to stand up in order to refute Boromir's dismissal of Aragorn, in order to state Aragorn's qualification. He stands to his feet and points out, this is no mere ranger. This is Aragorn, son of Arathorn. You owe him your allegiance. And this is typical extrovert thinking authority function. Yes, okay, most people would point out Aragorn's qualification anyway, because the fact that he's the king of Gondor by right is kind of a big deal. But when stacked up against Legolas's character as a whole, it's quite interesting that the first thing he says, the first persuasive argument he makes in the film, is one which actually refers to a rank, one which actually refers to Aragorn's authority. But much more than this, though, it demonstrates Legolas's deep sense of loyalty as a friend to Aragorn, his deep sense of introverted feeling attachment to this friendship, to this person who he has this natural connection with, despite being, on the surface, very different. And this is often the case in INFJ-INTJ relationships. There's this deep sense of connection and mutual understanding that oftentimes isn't even given voice. It's just accepted by the two. And despite their utility, despite their actions being very different, despite their speaking styles being different, despite what they even consider logical being very different, they have this underlying resonance with each other. And this loyalty and attachment to Aragorn is further demonstrated when, as soon as Aragorn says to Frodo, "You have my sword," Legolas immediately jumps up and says, "You have my bow," because he has Aragorn's back. And yes, the character of Gimli says, "And my axe," immediately after that, but that's because he doesn't want to be outdone by an elf. Whereas the vast majority of Legolas's actions are done firstly out of love for his friend, and secondly, out of a strong, deep sense of moral conviction. But ultimately, Legolas is a pragmatist. This is definitely demonstrated during the Helm's Deep siege. When Legolas sees the ragtag band of militia that Theoden is gathering together to assist in the defence of Rohan, Legolas quite happily points out, alongside Gimli, that they are too young and they are too old. These are not fit to serve on the battlefield. But Legolas actually goes further than Gimli, who was just making a casual remark, and says quite pragmatically, several hundred against 10,000, they don't stand a chance. They're all going to die. This is an INTJ's extrovert thinking authority function. He doesn't form his own logic, he doesn't form his own ideas of how things are going to go. He predicts them based upon what's externally obvious, and then he relates to them. And he predicts his own contingency based upon this sense of pragmatism, based upon a realism that Aragorn doesn't necessarily have. But Legolas's acceptance of Aragorn's plan immediately after, his apology for losing faith in Aragorn, is a major part of his character development. Oftentimes an INTJ will struggle letting go of their pragmatic nature. Oftentimes an INTJ will struggle taking a leap of faith, taking a risk, because if it doesn't seem likely. Oftentimes their emotional relation to this improbability can actually prevent them from taking such a leap of faith, can prevent them from taking the risk necessary in order to achieve their dreams. And Legolas overcoming this and lending Aragorn, his friend who he loves, his strength and his loyalty, regardless of the probabilities, is actually a huge step forward in Legolas's character development, and from that point onwards he never questions. From that point onwards he follows Aragorn's vision, and instinctively, again because of this introverted intuitive resonance between these two individuals of Legolas and Aragorn, both of these individuals know on this introverted intuitive wavelength that this vision is not Aragorn's. It is Gandalf living on through Aragorn. This vision is Gandalf's, but it's more than Gandalf's, because again the introverted intuitive dominant within Middle-earth is intrinsically connected to the spiritual plane. Not in a direct sense, but in the sense that understands the interconnectedness of everything. And both of these individuals know from that point onwards that there is a power beyond their own, and that they can surrender themselves to this power and take on faith that everything will work out if they follow their own convictions, if they follow the path that has been forged for them by a higher power. And of course this is not to say Legolas's overcoming of his extrovert thinking authority has effectively subdued the function. And it is not to say that his extrovert thinking authority has ever been a weakness. But it is to say that in overcoming it and being able to bypass it, he further activated the potential of his cognitive stack. And as an individual, he is now able to not only perceive the logic of the external world and relate to it, but also act on faith. And that is a great freedom. But this divergent stack of Legolas, in which this extrovert thinking authority function resides, is also the reason for Legolas's supreme mastery over combat. This is typically the INTJ. They often want to excel in whatever they pursue. And it isn't out of a sense of insecurity, it isn't out of a sense of competitiveness with other people, say perhaps their closest friends. Oftentimes it is merely a competitiveness with themselves. This is a type who wants to constantly challenge themselves. This is a type who wants to continuously upgrade and reach the next step in their own transformative development. They're always pushing themselves forward. They're always trying to reach the next step because the INTJ competes with themselves. Because the introverted, intuitive, introverted feeling dominant spark of the INTJ compels them to move forward towards a sense of self which is better than the version of them yesterday. And this is why Legolas has this flamboyant combat style. This is why Legolas does these ridiculous stunts such as riding a shield down the steps of Helm's Deep while firing arrows at Uruk-hai. This is why Legolas has very unorthodox styles of combat, because he's always trying to explore new ways of perfecting his combat style. And it is not to show off even in front of Gimli, although his competitiveness with Gimli is a fun distraction. And since Gimli is a friend, he's happy to be competitive with him in the first place. But more than that, Legolas just wants to challenge himself, and he wants to continuously improve upon his method of contributing. Because oftentimes the INTJ may even feel insecure about their unwillingness, innate unwillingness to contribute on an extrovert feeling level, and they will try to make up for that with action. They will want to contribute through action to the very best of their ability, especially when it's a cause they highly believe in. And furthermore, it's highly apparent that Legolas's extrovert thinking machinations are done through an extrovert sensing lens, because he has a very dual approach to combat. He sees a single enemy and he locks onto them. Oftentimes Legolas, and indeed other INTJs, would prefer to fixate on a single object, a single challenge, and pursue that with this great extrovert sensing, extrovert thinking intensity. And this is why Legolas tends to gravitate towards duels in combat. He seeks to duel the cave troll, he seeks to duel and Mumakil and battle at the Pelennor fields, and oftentimes he succeeds and goes above and beyond people's expectations. On the whole, Legolas is this deep, introverted, intuitive feeler who's strong in his convictions, highly secure in who he is, but also highly competitive with himself and constantly seeking to transform himself to even greater heights. All the while having a divergent stack that instills in him a sense of pragmatism and that locks his gaze onto specific challenges that he then relates to through his introvert intuition and introvert feeling, and then projects his desire for self-transformation through the mastery of his craft. One of the most fascinating relationships in this entire series is the one between Legolas and Gimli. Macrocosmically, they represent the great division between elvenkind and dwarfkind, but also through their gradual reconciliation with each other. This again instills a sense of hope for the future, not only of man in the case of Aragorn and Boromir, but for the future of sentient life across the planet as a whole. And in reality, it doesn't take very long at all for Legolas and Gimli to develop this close bond. They do trade harsh words initially, such as the Council of Elrond, where Gimli said he'd be damned before he sees a ring in the hands of an elf, never trust an elf. And Legolas remarking in response to Gandalf's comments leading up to the Path of Moria about dwarves forgetting their own secrets, that it doesn't surprise him in the slightest bit. Well within earshot of Gimli, which is one of the rare occasions we actually see Legolas trying to affect other people on an emotional level. But upon proving themselves to each other in combat, they very quickly gain a sense of mutual respect. They see each other's bravery. Legolas sees the bravery of Gimli, and his introverted feeling identity respects it. Gimli sees the utility of Legolas, and his extrovert thinking dominant function respects that. And this is often why INTJs and ENTJs often get along really well in real life. They have a healthy sense of competition, with the ENTJ respecting the mastery of the INTJ, and the INTJ respecting the sheer relentlessness of the ENTJ. And it is very difficult to type Gimli, because so much of the films we see him playing more of a comic relief role. So taking the films as we are within this series rather than the books, it can be very difficult to get a serious, credible portrayal of Gimli's character. But in the first film we see a lot of his more serious side, and it is in the first film that he demonstrates this extroverted thinking, extroverted sensing hammer that he tends to approach all situations with. For example, as soon as Elrond says the ring must be destroyed, Gimli says, well, what are we waiting for? And then he gets his axe, charges towards the ring and just whacks it, because obviously no one else would have had that idea in the past few centuries. And this is often a very ENTJ-like approach. They get this idea in the head and they don't necessarily relate to other people sufficiently so as to predict whether or not someone else would have already tried it. Furthermore, he's obviously very comfortable in a position of representative leadership. he quite happily represents the dwarves in the Council of Elrond. He is by far the most vocal out of all of them. And furthermore, Gimli is very happy to affect the emotional atmosphere of the world around him, dipping as he does into extroverted feeling, in order to convey extroverted thinking information. But this is especially so when it's moving towards a future which is comfortable, which has pleasure, because oftentimes the oppositional introverted feeling, introverted intuition of the ENTJ compels them towards a lifestyle, compels them towards a moment in the concrete extrovert thinking, extrovert sensing reality which is pleasurable, which is enjoyable. Oftentimes this is a very pleasure-seeking or excitement-seeking type. And this nature of the ENTJ, even though it's such a core of their being, is often overlooked in this commander stereotype. And while in many ways Gimli does live up to this commander stereotype, this is not the core of who he is. At the core, Gimli is someone who moves according to an oppositional introverted feeling function, which is connected to an introverted intuitive vision of the future, through a utilization of extroverted thinking and extroverted sensing in order to affect the concrete world in an oftentimes blunt and direct manner. And this tendency to move towards a future which has extroverted sensing ramifications is very much demonstrated when, very early into the Fellowship's journey, Gimli puts to Gandalf, who is of course sitting alone on a rock contemplating, that he should lead them down into the mines of Moria. His cousin Balin would, in his own words, give them a royal welcome. And he doesn't even let this go. In typical ENTJ fashion, he uses the avalanche atop the mountains as an opportunity to persuade the Fellowship to go down the mines of Moria. And of course, once they get there, he starts boasting about how they'll soon enjoy red meat off the bone. He's looking forward to it. He's looking forward to the pleasure of it. And this pleasure orientation is further exemplified at the shore of Amon Hen, when he starts complaining to the hobbits of this awful journey they have ahead of them. An impossible labyrinth of razor-sharp rocks, and after that it gets even better. Stinking, festering marshlands as far as the eye can see. Gimli is not looking forward to this in the slightest bit, because his comfort, his pleasure-seeking orientation, essentially lowers his morale. In absence of the thrill of immediate combat, Gimli is unable to distract himself from this reality. And again, in typical ENTJ fashion, can very much fall into this slump of self-pity. But also in typical ENTJ fashion, it's his deep sense of pride and self-worth that pushes himself beyond his limits time and time again to prove himself on the battlefield, to prove himself to other people. And even wearing this full plate of armour, he's able to keep up with Legolas and Aragorn, who effectively are both rangers, one of which is an elf. When running across the plains of Rohan, this is an incredible feat, and while, okay, yeah, the audience is supposed to laugh at him because he's falling down the hill and laughably trying to restore his bruised ego by saying that dwarves are more natural sprinters, very dangerous over short distances, but in many ways this distracts from the incredible feat that he's performing. In full plate armour, he's keeping up with a man and an elf who are barely weighed down on his short little legs. This is incredible. Time and time again, Gimli proves himself. Time and time again, Gimli's driven by his pride to go above and beyond. And it is through this bravery, it is through this relentless courage of this dwarf that Legolas overcomes his prejudice against dwarves as a whole and forms this really deep and intimate connection with Gimli, which is almost, if not at the same level to, his friendship with Aragorn. And Gimli's character arc is one of overcoming his introverted feeling oppositional function. It's one of overcoming what is in reality this strong fear, this strong aversion to uncomfortable situations. And just as Legolas overcomes his own pragmatism and learns to act on faith, Gimli overcomes his own self-preservative attitude. And more than this, he overcomes his own pride. For example, in Helm's Deep, whereas before he said in the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, no one tosses a dwarf, he actually asks Aragorn to pick him up and throw him into a bridge of Uruk-hai. Why? Because he was invested in the task, and because he let go of his pride and he was more interested in achieving an outcome. And oftentimes the pride of the ENTJ does trip them up. Oftentimes an ENTJ wants to be perceived as valuable to other people, so much that they can actually become less valuable in the process because they are averse to taking risks when those risks, if they are not successful, might actually cause a loss of esteem in the eyes of other people. And this need to maintain the esteem of other people is shown time and time again. Not only does he point out, when rather amazingly keeping up with Aragorn and Legolas on the fields of Rohan, that dwarves are natural sprinters, very dangerous over short distances, but also when he's on a horse and he falls off, when travelling with Theoden and his cohort to Helm's Deep, he says, although the film makes it out to be comic relief and in reality it's quite serious, that it was deliberate. Nobody panic, it was deliberate. Again, this is an ETJ trying not to lose face in the eyes of people who they want to respect them. And a real tipping point for this character's development is in actually the City of the Dead, when Aragorn and Legolas almost quite willingly go in to the caves, which are, echoing with silent screams of cursed souls. Gimli is highly averse to doing so. He says, this is unheard of. A man and an elf go underground whereas a dwarf dare not. I'd never see the end of it. Gimli is averse to going into the situation, but nonetheless he sees his two friends go in there and he overcomes his discomfort aversion. He overcomes this introverted feeling oppositional fear of an unknown introverted feeling experience. He doesn't know how he will be affected by this, but nonetheless he goes through into it and he comes out a stronger character. Because by the end of the film, so when Aragorn suggests they all lead the armies of man to the gates of Mordor to draw out the armies and give Frodo and Sam a chance to pass through lands which would have been otherwise swarming with orcs, Gimli doesn't hesitate this time. It's a terrible situation. It has almost no chance of success. He'll be extremely uncomfortable and he'll probably lose a lot of face. But Gimli, having overcome his own pragmatism, having overcome his own pride, having overcome his aversion to unknown and uncomfortable situations, he doesn't hesitate this time. He is actually the first person to consent. He volunteers for it straight away. He says, certainty of death, small chance of success, what are we waiting for? Because by this point in his character development, Gimli is willing to act on faith. He is willing to go through with Aragorn, that is to say, Gandalf the Grey's vision of the future, knowing that it's all worked out so far. And even if the odds say otherwise, he is willing to commit himself to this cause. He is willing to lay down his life for the greater good. Having dropped all of these previous hang-ups and vices, both Gimli and Legolas end the films much freer individuals than they were in the past. And the development of these two representatives of their respective races also represents hope for sentient life across the entire world. A world now in which all races can live in peace without prejudice against each other. A world in which people can finally be unified under a single cause and need no longer fight amongst each other. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this episode. So I really hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was informative. And before you leave, I'd love to know down in the comments below what character you relate to the most. Is it a character I've mentioned in this episode, or is it another one entirely? Personally, I relate to Gandalf a lot. He's got this kind of hyper-convergent, introverted intuition, introverted thinking. He's very contemplative, but he also has this kind of polar extrovert sensing, extrovert feeling side where he seems to come alive in one-on-one interactions. And you may have noticed in my collaboration with David Badarina that I tend to do the same. I tend to have this really serious, stern, contemplative side, but I also have this kind of goofy, bouncy, extrovert sensing, extrovert feeling side when I'm interacting with someone one-on-one. Please do not hesitate to leave your requests below in the comments, because I'm going to definitely do a few more of these this year. I enjoy them, you seem to enjoy them, and honestly it's useful to have some kind of representation, even if it isn't real life, of how cognitive functions can manifest. And once again, don't be afraid to share this video with fellow Lord of the Rings geeks such as myself. So thank you so much again for watching the video, especially if you made it all the way to this point. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to hit that subscribe button below with the bell icon next to it to stay notified of future content. I upload at least one video every single week, so I'll be back same place, same time next week. Take care.